Welcome to Wedding Film 101. My name is Bobby, and in this video, we're talking all about camera frame rates for wedding filmmaking. Maybe you're brand new to filmmaking or a photographer making the transition who already has some camera knowledge. In either case, frame rate can feel a bit complicated, but it's important to understand, and I'm here to make it easy for you. So what is frame rate? Well, frame rate is one of the camera settings that you'll need to decide on when shooting video, and loosely speaking, it refers to the number of frames per second of footage, which is why you'll often see it described as frames per second, such as 24 frames per second or 24 FPS. This comes from the time of film where it was measured in frames of film, but in today's terms, you can kind of think of it like a series of images that blend together to make 1 second of video. Frame rate is also what gives you the option of slow motion video. This may be a lot of numbers, but hang with me here. Let's say you're editing and delivering your video at 24 frames per second. If you shoot your video at the same frame rate as your editing timeline, it will have just the right amount of frames per second. You can play it back in real time, but you aren't able to slow it down. There isn't any extra wiggle room there. But let's say you shot your footage at 60 frames per second. Well, now you have extra frames available if you wanted to slow this footage down and stretch it out. It's a math equation. 24 divided by 60 is 0.4, which means that you could slow the footage down to 40%. And the higher frame rate you shoot in, the more you can slow down your footage. Your camera likely has multiple frame rate options, and they have different use cases depending on what you're shooting and how you like to shoot. You may not have access to all of these, but let's dive into the most common ones, why they exist, how they're used, and things to be aware of. First is 24 frames per second, which is the term we'd commonly use, but it's usually actually 23.98 frames per second. This is what a lot of wedding videos are exported at, so it's the most native frame rate usually. 24 frames per second has a very organic look to it, and it's aesthetically pleasing. For a wedding, we commonly shoot at 24 frames per second for any video where we might need to line up external audio, especially longer segments of audio. Two great examples of this would be the ceremony and speeches. While it is possible to shoot these at higher frame rates, you don't often have a reason to slow them down, and shooting a higher frame rate for these scenarios may cause the external audio to drift out of sync over time. The downside of 24 frames per second is that you will not have the option to slow this footage down, and your editor will have less to work with for stabilization. The next common frame rate is 30 frames per second, which again is actually 29.97 if we're getting technical. This frame rate is less common to use, as the main reasoning to increase your frame rate would be to give you slow motion capabilities, but the difference is so small that it doesn't give you too much to work with. However, it is likely an option on your camera, so we want to be sure to mention it. Next up is 60 frames per second, and this is one of the most common frame rates used for wedding filmmakers. Again, technically it's 59.94 frames per second, but commonly referred to as 60. I personally shoot most of the day at 60 frames per second outside of longer sections with audio like we mentioned earlier. This allows me to drop these clips into my 24 frames per second editing timeline and either allow my editor to translate so they play at a normal speed, or with the math example we did earlier, I can slow them down to 40% in that scenario. This gives me more flexibility with my shots in the edit and often more stability as well. One thing to note is that 60 frames per second requires a minimum shutter speed of 1/120th, which will cut down your exposure a bit. This is great when you're in a setting with ample light, like outdoors, but it can be a negative side effect if you are in a darker setting. The last frame rate we'll talk about is 120 frames per second, and the thinking here is very similar to 60 frames per second. Now, I don't personally shoot anything at this frame rate as I find it to be too slow when slowed all the way down, but I do know some people who enjoy the look. Again, it really just gives you the option to slow things down even further, all the way down to 20% speed on a 24 FPS timeline. And the downside of 120 is also similar to 60 in that your shutter speed needs to adjust accordingly, this time to a minimum of 1/240th, making shots in darker settings more difficult. So for a wedding filmmaker, again, I commonly find myself capturing footage in a mix of 60 and 24 frames per second throughout the day. If you have any questions about frame rate, drop them down below in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.